Now, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Marwick to the team. So let me do that very quickly. Uh, Very briefly, and of course, you will hear from Dr. Marwick and a lot of interesting research that she's doing. Dr. Marwick is an associate professor in the Department of Communication and principal researcher at the Center for Information Technology and Public Life, which she co-founded at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She studies the social, political, and cultural implications of popular social media technologies and is currently investigating the relationship between disinformation and far-right online radicalization, a topic that is of keen interest to the group and of course to the nation and the world. So the floor is yours, Dr. Marwick, and I would also request everyone to mute yourself. Please feel free to use the chat window if you have any questions or thoughts for our speaker. And of course, we'll open the floor towards the end for Q&A, and we can have a rich discussion. I'm sure there will be a lot of interesting questions. Please go ahead, Dr. Marwick.
Great, thank you so much for that nice introduction, and thanks for having me. Before I share my screen, so I'm a qualitative social scientist in a sort of humanities/social science program. But I did my postdoc at Microsoft Research, so I'm very familiar with presenting my research to computer scientists, information scientists, and data scientists. I will try to pitch my talk accordingly, but please do feel free to put questions in the chat while I'm speaking if there's something that I'm not making clear. And then I'm, of course, excited to have a robust discussion after this. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I use presenter view. So Chris, I'm hoping that what we're seeing here is the big, just one slide and not the presenter view. Is that correct?
Yes, that's perfect.
Perfect. Okay, great. Thank you, Microsoft, for, actually working. All right. So today I want to talk about work that I've done with my colleague, Will Parton, who's one of my students. He's a PhD candidate in comm and a student fellow at CTAP. Just a word about CTAP. We are one of the Knight-funded centers to look at the relationship between information technology and democracy. And we study things like political participation, disinformation, networked publics, the influence of social media on politics and journalism and things like that. And my colleagues here are like a very inspiring and exciting bunch. And I'm very happy to, for you, if you're interested in checking out our research center and the other things that we do and the other people there, that might be, if you're interested in the stuff I'm doing, you might be interested in their work as well. So this is a project that we worked on for about a year and a half. One of the papers is in final review with a journal, fingers crossed, and the other one we're hoping to have submitted by the end of the semester. And this paper is called Constructing Alternative Facts, Populist Expertise in the QAnon Conspiracy. So I do work on the far right and fringe groups and disinformation more broadly. I've been studying social media and social technologies in the academy for almost 20 years. But this, I'm really kind of giving you a very deep slice of QAnon today. So let's start with what got me interested in this project to begin with and why I pursued this research. So in 2019, I was browsing a Facebook group and it had this robust guide for how to identify a clickbait. And the top post, which you can see on the left here, was pinned by the moderator. And I had a long discussion of the business model of clickbait and what the moderator called news exploitation sites. And they asked participants politely not to post stories from such sites on the groups. And they provided a lot of helpful examples. And so you can see two of the examples they posted of clickbait and news exploitation were posts by Facebook pages called the United American Patriots and Just Say No to Liberals. And this is exactly the kind of sort of fake news that we heard a lot about after the 2016 election. Both of these stories are not true. And the moderator was saying, please don't post this type of thing on our group. But this group was a QAnon hub with almost 14,000 members. And Will and I found this very puzzling because the page administrators were advocating the kinds of practices that are often promoted as a solution to disinformation, media literacy, right? The idea that if you're thinking critically and you're rejecting clickbait, then you supposedly would reject counterfactual conspiracy theories like QAnon. So today I want to present what we found when we investigated this conundrum, the results of a pair of studies that we conducted in 2019 based on about 9 months of non-participant observation in QAnon groups on Facebook, and then a set of image boards called 4chan, 8chan, and 8kun. And if you're not familiar with those, I'll explain what those are. And I'm currently doing field work right now, and one of my research sites is QAnon groups on Telegram. So I am going to end by kind of bringing you up to speed on what they're up to these days. And in short, I'm really interested in the media literacy practices of QAnon and sort of by proxy, other fringe and far right and extremist groups, and what this can tell us about how such communities create, distribute, and interpret information online. So the structure of this talk: first, I'll give you a brief sense of what QAnon is and what makes it different from some other online conspiracies. Second, I'm going to sort of tip my hat to a broader social science literature around conspiracy theories. Third, I want to walk you through 2 of QAnon's interpretive practices. One is how posts by Q, and I'll explain all of this, how they're interpreted and proved by QAnon members. And second, this thing called the Q clock, which is what this illustration is of, and sort of the expertise that goes into using it. And then I want to talk about this concept of populist expertise, which my colleague and I have come up with to refer to these types of practices. And finally, I'm going to tie this back to larger discussions in disinformation studies, which is sort of a subfield where I would situate myself right now. So let's start with the basics of QAnon. So QAnon is what's called a big tent conspiracy theory. It's very large. It includes a lot of other conspiracy theories, and it morphs based on current events. But in its most basic form, QAnon holds that former President Trump is battling a group of deep state Democrats and entrenched insiders who are satanic pedophiles, and Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama among them, but also Hollywood elites like Tom Hanks and scions of industry like Mark Zuckerberg. And the theory goes, one of these days, there's going to be a sort of day of reckoning where this group of people gets their comeuppance. It turns out that Trump has been sort of planning this all along. He will be reinstated as president, and there will be a great awakening that takes place. And this is very tied to sort of evangelical Christian notions of the apocalypse, or the revelations and good and evil. And there's a lot of this sort of almost action movie, sci-fi kind of imagery in these groups around what's going to happen during the Great Awakening. There's going to be this like vanquishing of evil. So what does this actually look like? So the idea that a group of wealthy elites controls the world is about as basic a conspiracy theory as you can get. But there's a few things that make QAnon unique. Unlike other conspiracy theories, it's based on basically message board posts, which they call drops, from this anonymous figure called Q. And Q claims to be a Trump administration insider. So somebody with like access to government knowledge, spy knowledge, foreign policy knowledge, lots of like government secrets. And this person Q posted originally on the image boards known as 4chan. QAnon was kicked off 4chan. They moved to basically an image board clone called 8chan. That closed, and then they moved to an image board called 8kun. And then Q stopped posting more or less right around the 2020 election and hasn't posted since. Now, 4chan, the image board, is pretty notorious, so you might have heard of it. It was known in the mid-aughts of being the origin of a lot of very popular early internet memes. So things like lolcats or rickrolling, if you've heard of those. There's a great book by a woman named Whitney Phillips called "This Is Why We Can't Have Nice Things," where she chronicles the early practices of 4chan. 4chan was also very influential during the 2016 election. The 4chan poll board was sort of the birth of, I would call it, the sort of online alt-right. And they did a lot of sort of memeing. They claimed that they had memed President Trump into the White House. So Q themselves have posted thousands of times. These are 3 examples of Q's posts. They are obscure sequences of words and numbers. And people who subscribe to this conspiracy theory think of these posts as infallible, like they're totally correct. And they believe that they predict future events and that they explain past events. These drops are also very cryptic. They often contain chains of leading questions. They ask the reader to do the research or follow this person or that person, which really just means like go look them up on Google. Sometimes they ask people to do very specific things like reverse image search. And Q's explanation for why these are such sort of obscure and difficult to understand posts is that if they were more clear, people would know who they are and they would be in danger. So they're sort of by design very difficult to understand. So in QAnon lore, decoding these drops and understanding them supposedly aids Trump in his fight against the corrupt elites. So QAnon not only gives the sympathetic reader inside information about current events, which is a core appeal of many conspiracy theories, that sort of you know something that other people don't, it's also a way to shape those events through the production of new knowledge. So by interpreting Q's posts, you're actually helping, the forces of good. You're a keyboard warrior. So in the basics of conspiracy theory is that virtually every conspiracy theory is predicated on the same basic assumption, that there's this secret group of powerful people that are responsible for some kind of social phenomenon. And we tend to think of conspiracies as uniquely modern, as something that's very 20th or 21st century, but they've actually been around through human history. And certain conspiracy theories, like anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that Jewish people secretly control the world, that has been around for hundreds of years in various forms. But most people who study conspiracy theories agree that they express anxiety about losing your individualism in a complex society, that you're being controlled by somebody else, or that somebody else is really pulling the strings, that you're not actually in charge. But we can also think of a conspiracy theory as sort of a framework or a story, and it shares certain styles and logics and tropes and myths with other conspiracy theories. Like they often, if you read a lot of conspiracy theories, they start to kind of sound very similar. And this is particularly true with the rise of big tent conspiracy theories like QAnon, which weave multiple theories together and morph as current events change. So as you might imagine, COVID has been huge for QAnon, and they've come up with all kinds of conspiracy theories that, focus on vaccines and 5G and Bill Gates' role in it and all these other sort of obscure things. So there's lots of disciplines that study conspiracy theories. Social psychologists are very interested in finding a personality type or attributes that are common to conspiracy believers. So is there something about a particular kind of person that makes them more likely to believe in a conspiracy theory? So sometimes there's a sense that it's people who don't feel like they're effective in their political lives. They don't feel like they have other ways to make changes, or that they're more open to experience than other people. I'm more persuaded by scholars in anthropology, cultural studies, and sociology who instead look at conspiracy theories as a social phenomenon. And this research, some of which is really, really interesting, like ethnographies of people who hold fringe beliefs, finds that conspiracy believers strongly believe themselves to be critical free thinkers, and that they're loosely arranged in interlinked networks, that they are communities. And as communities, as they become more and more involved in the community, they sort of learn how to interpret things, and they share this common understanding that they learn over time in interacting with other members of the community. Yeah, that's this one. And although people do come to believe conspiracy theories, oh, sorry, I did not mean to do that, conspiracy theories on their own, the internet has really exacerbated this process because there's so many communities of conspiracy theorists, and QAnon is absolutely a community. It adheres to many of the tenets of online community that we can identify. So many of the communities, these conspiratorial communities, and in my field work, I've also found that this is very common to sort of new age or spiritual or occult communities, which overlap greatly with conspiracy theorists. they are very skeptical of traditional knowledge-making institutions. So science, the academy, journalism, government. Instead, they are generally open to various other types of knowledge claims. So there's a big emphasis on, for example, personal experience, or on your feeling about something, or faith, or religious experience, mysticism, the occult, the Bible, etc. And the ability to evaluate and read these knowledge claims, to sort of understand these as knowledge and to accept them as knowledge, is a hallmark of these communities. And so this is a great book by Mark Fenster, Conspiracy Theories, Secrecy and Power in American Culture, where he says, conspiracy theory demands continual interpretation. There is always something more to know about an alleged conspiracy. Conspiracy theory works as a form of hyperactive semiosis, or semiotics, like reading signs, in which history and politics serve as reservoirs of signs that demand overinterpretation and that signify for the interpreter far more than their conventional meaning. So he wrote this in 2008, but this describes QAnon very well, because they read current events and politics, like newspaper stories, Fox News and CNN. They sort of see these as symbols and signs that there's a deeper meaning to that they can interpret and read into. This practice of interpreting a text is also a key element of Henry Jenkins' concept of participatory culture. And Henry Jenkins is a media theorist at the, he's at USC now, University of Southern California, in their School of Communication, in the Annenberg School. And he is sort of a pioneer of fan studies and studies of online community. And he was very interested in the shift from a kind of culture where you just kind of sit and watch TV or you watch movies, to a culture of participation. So you are actually participating in creating culture. And he formulated these theories in the context of early fan cultures like Star Trek fans, and early internet groups like Twin Peaks, Usenet groups. If anybody's familiar with the David Lynch series Twin Peaks from the 90s, it was very mysterious, and fans would work together to analyze a text, scrutinizing it for clues. And today there's thousands of fan communities, from people who like Taylor Swift, who's very well known for putting sort of like secret messages in her lyrics, to people who watch reality shows like The Bachelor, who want to kind of predict what's going on or learn about spoilers, to people who are fans of true crime, who want to kind of figure out what happened in a cold case. This type of close engagement and investigation is still a hallmark of online fan groups. And his definition of participatory culture, I think, is still very relevant today. He said it's a culture that has low barriers to expression and civic engagement. In other words, it's easy to get involved. You don't have to be like an amazing artist or an incredible writer. That there's support for creating and sharing one's creations, and there's some type of informal mentorship whereby what is known by the most experienced is passed along to novices. So more recently, and this is getting a little bit into the weeds of like disciplinary arguments within communication, but there's a media theorist named Thorsten Quandt who's come up with a concept of dark participation, which is basically like, well, what if it's participation and people are participating, but they're doing something that is like normatively bad, like they're trolling or harassing people, or they're conspiracy theorists, or they're members of the alt-right or the far right. And so he sort of says, well, participation is good. So if people are doing this kind of stuff, but they're not doing it for good reasons, it's dark participation. Will and I don't really buy this whole theory. We think that they're all just forms of participation, and that it shouldn't be up to the scholar to decide what's good and what's bad. I think we have to really grapple with the fact that when we think about increasing participation and increasing involvement, we've generally thought of that as a good thing. But today, there's forms of political participation that want to like curtail voting rights or overturn democratic decisions or promote censorship. And those are also forms of participation. So sort of how do we grapple with this? Specifically, we build upon the findings of media sociologist Francesca Tripodi, who is one of my colleagues here at CTAP, who in her 2018 report for Data and Society argued that conservative Americans use techniques learned in Bible study to read media texts. This practice she calls scriptural inference, And it involves scrutinizing primary sources line by line to unpack their meaning. And she frames this as a form of media literacy. So if you've ever, studied the Bible or studied some other book or taken an English class, you kind of learn to go line by line through a text and really like look at the words, like try to unpack the hidden meanings. She saw people doing this not just with religious texts, but also with things like a tax bill or a speech by President Trump, and then comparing it to the way it was covered by the news. And on the right here, I have a screenshot from that someone posted very recently, January 6th, on one of my Telegram groups, where this is a book that's, it's one of those books that gives you like a Bible verse to read and then an interpretation of the Bible verse. And she's doing her Bible study, but she's combining it with something called gematria, which is a Jewish, it's kind of like a mystical Kabbalistic form of numerology. Like you put a message into this gematria reader, there are these websites, and it spits out a number. So it's like an alphanumeric translator. And QAnons currently believe that if you read gematria, you can sort of uncover hidden meanings. So here you can see that she's literally combining Bible study with this gematria technique that she's learned as part of somebody in a QAnon group. And QAnon participants engage in this type of close reading within online communities, combining scriptural inference with elements of collective interpretation that we see in participatory culture. And so we're really interested in how this interpretive practice that is generally associated with conservatives, how does that change when it's done as a group, when it's done on the internet? Well, what it does is it gives rise to this very powerful community of believers who are very committed to a conspiracy despite its frequently incorrect and counterfactual claims. So I'm going to turn back to QAnon and run through two of their interpretive practices to analyze this in more detail. So first, I want to talk about proofs. So a proof is a document, YouTube video, or most commonly what Joan Donovan and PM Kraft call an evidence collage. And that's an evidence collage on the right. It's this kind of thing that looks like it was made in Microsoft Paint. You see these all over the internet that prove certain things. They often have these red lines and these sort of like, it looks like a board in a detective show or something where they're trying to figure out like who's the head of the mafia or whatever. But in this case, these proofs prove that Q's predictions are accurate, meaning that they are who they say they are. And Q says in their drops, future proves past. So, you'll find out, this thing will happen, you'll see that I was right all along. So I want to talk through how a drop like the one on the left, this missile Fox 3 splash thing, this is like a text that Q posted on 8chan. How does this become a proof like the one at the right? And at the time that we were doing field work, Q was actively posting on 8chan. So we got to see this happen. And I don't know if you've ever been on an image board like 4chan or 8chan, but they're very chaotic. Anyone can post, you don't need an account. Everyone's anonymous, which is why they're called QAnons, because they're anonymous. And because it's an image board, you can post an image to go along with your post. And people post all kinds of images, from these types of weather pictures that you see in the proof to like pornography and gore and political things, all kinds of stuff. And it's very hard to understand who's replying to who. You have to kind of learn how to read 8chan, like how to use it. So the entire thing is very confusing. There's also lots of people who will show up on 8chan to troll the QAnons and post all kinds of unrelated content. So lots of side conversations. But generally when Q would post, everyone would stop whatever they were talking about and they'd immediately go into trying to interpret the drop. Like, what does this mean? And the people on the 8chan boards where Q's drops appeared called themselves bakers, because they sift through crumbs of evidence dropped by Q. And so what they do is they throw out potential interpretations of each drop, and they generally back these up with a wide array of evidence. And this included Bible verses, tweets, news stories, Wikipedia pages, flight records, LinkedIn profiles, like all kinds of things. Another hallmark of Q's drops is that they're intended to be decoded. And there's this implication that each drop has this hidden meaning that bakers must work out for themselves. They often ask questions, they include unlabeled images, they tell readers to think critically. So when bakers are interpreting these drops, they have to grapple with the entire corpus or body of Q's drops, which, as I said, are in number in the thousands. There's thousands of these messages, and somebody who's a real expert is familiar with all of them. And more recently, they apply the same techniques to basically everything Trump ever tweeted, all of his speeches, all of his sort of political utterances. So they pay very close attention to the text of the drop, including spellings, numbers, capital letters, alternate meanings, and so forth. And as you'll see, this is very similar to these practices of Bible study chronicled by Francesca Tripodi. So this is a screenshot from an ebook that's sort of like QAnon 101. There's a lot of these floating around. We have about 15 of them, that these like 1,000-page ebooks that are sort of like, what is QAnon and how to get involved. And bakers learn these practices of Q drop interpretation from each other. Now, this is by no means the only way that people interpret Q's posts. In fact, if you read a bunch of these how-to, they mostly contradict. And this doesn't really make a lot of sense if you sit and read it. Basically, they're saying you start from the bottom and go up. But as you'll see, that's not always how people do it. So on 8chan, people threw out all kinds of explanations about what a particular drop might mean. So for example, when they were decoding drop 432, which is this missile Fox 3 thing, they suggested several explanations for the unusual spelling of missile in the second line. Could the missing I in missile mean Miss Lee, the reporter or hostage rescued by Bill Clinton from North Korea? Maybe a missile is a missile that's been taken over in flight by an unintended party. And most of these get ignored, or people are like, that doesn't sound very plausible. And because this early process involves a lot of brainstorming and wild guesses, suggestions that seem particularly unlikely are often met very skeptically. So one Anon ranted, the biggest problem is people use every word Q says to try to completely invent fantastic assumptions. Yeah. Okay, so how do we get from these kind of interpretation to the closure? And this is a term from Science and Technology Studies, interpretive closure, that basically means like people agree upon the meaning of something. In some cases, Q verifies an explanation. So for example, somebody posted this splash Fox 3, which is a cut and paste from like a Navy glossary website. And Q actually said, yes, that's correct. So that is automatically true. Secondly, there's this thing called notables, which is at the end of every 8chan thread, because it's so chaotic, a volunteer moderator will basically close the thread, pull out anything they think was important and make a list of notables. And then they'll ask other people like, did I miss anything? And so if something gets cataloged in notables, it's more likely to be picked up later as something that's important, but that's just done by some random volunteer. It's like not like that person has any more authority than anybody else. And the third way is that someone takes the initiative to create an evidence collage, YouTube video, or other form of evidence. So this is another evidence collage on the left that includes the same drop, the missile Fox 3 splash, but it's a completely different interpretation. So you see a lot of these sort of competing interpretations. All right, we're running low on time, so I'm gonna kind of, I think, hit the highlights of the rest of the talk. So one thing that I think is most important is that there is a lot of citation in these QAnon practices. Most of the time they cited right-leaning sources like Breitbart and the Gateway Pundit, but we also saw lots of examples of mainstream media sources like ABC News, Bloomberg, CNBC. We also saw links to Wikipedia, tweets, Google Maps, Google search results, etc. Now, we often think of conspiracy theorists as these kind of gullible people who will accept anything, but our findings really complicate this assessment. QAnons demonstrated very wide-ranging knowledge about current and past events. They questioned the legitimacy of sources or the conclusions that other participants came to. And above all, they admonished others to do the research or think critically, messages that frequently appear in appeals to media literacy. So this is a meme that was shared in a QAnon Facebook group. If you're not going to do the research, then shut the F up. And then on the right, we're leading you to water, not asking you to drink the Kool-Aid. Always do your own research. And although their research often led them to outlandish conclusions, they have this set of practices that make them seem systematic and authoritative. We're not saying this is these are equally valid to, academic research or anything like that, but we want to make sure that people understand that there is an internal logic to QAnon, and it does run in many ways in parallel to how we make knowledge in the academy or think tanks, things like that. So I was going to go into this thing called the Q clock, but it's kind of hard to explain, and it's mostly just another example of what I already showed you. But this is a kind of quasi-scientific instrument that QAnons have come up to basically to like read Trump's tweets. So I'm going to skip this because I don't think it's as interesting. So ultimately, we argue that the forms of knowledge and interpretation that are furthered by QAnon adherents constitute what we call populist expertise. So the rejection of legacy media accounts, scientific consensus, or elite knowledge in favor of a body of homegrown information generated by those who may feel disenfranchised from mainstream political participation. So this combines populist rejection of expertise, because if you think about populism, it's generally like we reject elites, we reject authority, with the parallel creation of archives and instruments and practices that create knowledge and information that support the logical consistency of otherwise incorrect arguments. So it's not that Anons oppose expertise completely, but they definitely reject the normative version of expertise that we see in the academy and civil society and the quote unquote deep state. They see this as progressive, they see it as globalist. They don't see it as ideologically neutral. And so rather than rejecting expertise, they try to claim expertise in their own particular way. So what does this mean for those of us who study disinformation? So first of all, we need to very critically think through positioning media literacy as a potential solution. Conservative forms of media literacy draw on fundamentally different epistemological assumptions than elites' form of expertise, including this deep, close reading of primary texts and these validations of other forms of understanding and knowledge. And on the right here, I have a gematria reading from Telegram. It's complex decoding of textual evidence. It's not a form of literacy that any of us in this room would recognize. It's deeply rooted in religious practices, but it is accepted as valid in these groups, along with things like personal experience, faith, and feeling. Second, doing your own research is consistently central to a huge variety of fringe and far-right groups, including QAnon, flat earthers, anti-vaxxers, white supremacists. These groups already think of themselves as highly literate critical thinkers. But often when they do this research, they're doing it within communities that reject scientific or journalistic expertise in favor of populist expertise. So if you're just trying to fact check people and you're like, well, this is wrong because I have a study that says so, that's not going to work because they've already rejected that form of expertise. Finally, QAnon can be understood as a participatory culture that demonstrates both the creative and supportive aspects of participatory communities while espousing anti-democratic and anti-institutional ideals, which calls into question our inherently positive framing of participation and its counterpart of dark participation. And recently, if you're familiar with the work of Kate Starbird at the University of Washington, she's begun talking about participatory disinformation that's created within communities from the bottom up, and the sort of complex relationship between political elites, hyperpartisan and legacy media, and internet communities. We really need to start understanding how information circulates through these communities in increasingly complex ways. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alice. This was fantastic. I couldn't even see how the time moved past. It was even the almost like code breaking. So it left me wondering what type of courses or curriculum would be needed to train folks to be able to understand this and maybe even combat some of the influence or type of disinformation campaigns.
That's a great question. And that's sort of the one I get a lot. It's like, well, what do we do if people have these really radical forms of knowledge that are really different? Like, what do we do about them? And I'm not really sure, to tell you the truth. There's various suggestions that you can lead people into understanding that their point of view is wrong. You can try to adopt similar faith-based understanding and discussing with them, but it is really hard because you're coming from such a different place. Like if you're an academic researcher and you're like, well, I want to combat these conspiracy theorists or these QAnon people, there's going to be a level of distrust there that I think is going to be hard to combat. I think a lot of this is going to be done on a more personal level within more relational networks. So maybe faith-based networks or community networks where there's sort of an acknowledgement of what the commonalities are between you and the people who hold these beliefs, right? And going from there, like I've talked to a few people who do what they call street epistemology, which is this like method where you basically use the Socratic method to try to make people understand that they're not correct. And I don't think that works. I think that just comes off as like, you know better than they do, you're smarter than them. Again, you're bumping into this like sense of populism where, many of the people in this group are very suspicious of traditional forms of authority. So it's a really good question. I mean, that's kind of why we wanted to do these kinds of projects, was to come up with more solutions. But right now we're still kind of like, okay, well, now we figured out how it works. Where do we go from here?
Awesome. Yeah, I think we could have even done, 2-part series or 3-part series for your talk. And could have heard a little bit more about the pseudo-scientific device, the Q clock.
The Q clock, yeah.
It looked very fancy.
It's very fancy. It's also a little crazy, but
I bet. Let's open the floor for question answers. I'm sure folks are amazed by all this type of interesting research.
Yes, thank you so much. It was a great presentation. I really enjoyed it. Just wanted to tell you that it was really inspiring. I'm thinking about how can I apply some mathematical models in the spread of conspiracy theory or misinformation about this group and the misinformation about QAnon. It was so inspiring. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Miriam. Let's see, any other questions?
Hello, thank you so much, Alice. I joined late, unfortunately. I'm so blown away by how they find the time to put so much work into this. So that having been said, have you had any information regarding any possible ways to obtain data about the demographics of the users?
That's a great, sorry, Esther, I didn't mean to interrupt. That's a great question. I started out in 2016 studying alt-right groups, which were mostly like young men posting on 4chan. And this is a very different group of people. I've been listening to, they have kind of like Clubhouse style chats on Telegram where there are these audio chat rooms. And there are a lot of people in middle age, a lot of people who strongly identify as Christian. I think a lot of people from outside urban areas. And they would skew probably older, I think, than a lot of internet communities. They're mostly, but not all, white. So you're talking, I think, about people who would fall fairly squarely into traditional sort of Republican strongholds in terms of like people who are from traditionally conservative areas of the United States, although it's by no means just the United States. QAnon is an international movement. I don't think, even though, there's been some really interesting work done on, for example, the people who were at the Capitol coup a year ago in January, and how those people were not economically struggling. They were middle class, they were business owners. In some cases, they were very affluent. I do get the sense that some of these people are really struggling. There's a lot of discussions of medical problems. There's a lot of discussions of being on disability. And in terms of how they find the time, this is their hobby. This is what they do when they get home from work. They don't watch Netflix. They get on their computer and they talk to other people about QAnon. It's the same thing that people do when they, write Harry Potter fan fiction or post on Twitter. Clay Shirky about a decade ago called this cognitive surplus, the idea that a lot of people have these jobs that aren't super engaging. And so they use their mental energy engaging in sort of these types of participatory activities on the internet. And Shirky was talking about much more benign stuff like creating lolcats and posting on message boards, but it's definitely the same type of impetus and the same kind of, this is how they're using that cognitive surplus.
Great answer. Thank you so much. Very nice.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions?
I have a question. Thank you so much for the article. I really enjoyed it because I feel information is one of the imperative means of like communicating. So my question is, do you have any idea of what their motive was behind that, like spreading the conspiracy theory? Do you know, like, if there was like a motive behind that, maybe political means? Because why I realized that it was viral since up until 2021, the QAnon, but after 2021, it stopped, which is like, there's no like election coming up soon. Maybe it could be like an election strategy or something. Yeah.
That's also a really good question. So what is the motive behind people who participate? So I think some of these people are true believers. Like they honestly believe that there's going to be this like apocalyptic event. They want to be on the right side of that, and they want to sort of aid the people they think are on the right side of history. And so by decoding these drops and spending time in these communities, that's a form of political participation to them. Just like for other communities, it might be going to a march or signing a petition or something like that. I think also there's a strong sense of fear and urgency. You know, I didn't get into some of the more lurid parts of this conspiracy theory, but there's a lot of very frightening stuff out there about what these evil groups are doing. You know, some of you may have heard of some related conspiracy theories like around child trafficking or Wayfair or Save the Children. And so there's this whole thing about how this evil group of evil people are doing horrible things to children. And that I think really does motivate a lot of people, that they want to save these children that they think are being targeted. There's a sense that this is like a group of people who are like purely evil. So there's also, I think, a sense of strong urgency and morality that they want to help people by telling people about this conspiracy theory. And there's also lots of discussions in these groups about people who've been cut off from their family. They can't see their grandchildren. There's a subreddit called QAnon. What's it called? I think it's called like QAnon Anonymous or something like that, where people talk about how they've lost family members to QAnon. Like family members have become so involved in QAnon that they no longer can talk about anything else, or they no longer really have contact with their family. So for some people, this really does take over and become kind of an all-consuming obsession.
Very interesting. Thank you for the question, Dale. Any other question?
Thank you, Alice. That was really great. And, you know, I have learned a lot. I have to say that this pattern is actually existing in our communities too. We see that a lot, but not to that extent, not to the extent of making like a clock. So that's like really insightful. Thank you so much. Yeah. I just want to share that we have the same thing.
Well, thank you so much for that,
yeah.
that comment.
Thank you. Thank you
Thanks
so
for
much.
listening.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for that comment. And I noticed that we are at the top of the hour. So again, thank you so much, Alice, for this wonderful talk. And thank you everyone and the participants for joining us today morning. And next month, we will have another exciting talk. So looking forward to see you already. Thank you, everyone. Have a very nice day.